Colleagues, thank you for joining me. This presentation is essentially still a work in progress in the sense that my own thinking is still being formulated about the place of learning standards in making curriculum decisions. But this is going to chronicle my own personal journey from a standards evangelist to someone who is much more skeptical today. First, a presentation outline, a brief overview of my own personal journey and the evolution of our field during my career, how design pedagogy has become ascendant, and some of the work that we've done to try to improve design pedagogy through what we call informed design. And we'll discuss standards in industry and in education and dip into the Common Core. Then the question about whether standards or cross-cutting themes or contexts should drive curriculum and instruction. And then I'll present a case study of an NSF project called Engineering for All that is focused on revisiting thematic ideas in authentic social contexts. So the handsome dude on the left is Michael in 1964 when I started teaching. I was a secondary school teacher for 20 years, chaired a department. Then in '84, I moved up to Albany to take a post with the New York State Ed Department as a state supervisor for technology education. And since '97, I've been working at the Hofstra Center for STEM Research, co-directing that center with a friend of mine who's an engineering professor, running a National Science Foundation projects. So I went to school at City College, and that is a picture of where the industrial arts shops were, Clapper Hall. It was originally an orphan asylum. It was turned over to City College in the 40s. That's a remodeled building that you're looking at. In my graduating class in 1964 at CCNY, there were 200 boys who were graduated and were becoming industrial arts teachers. That's what the field was like. The focus was on craftsmanship in my undergraduate program. Professor Wiggins, who nicknamed himself Uncle Tweedle because he figured that he'd better nickname himself rather than have the students nickname him. He took all of these little puzzles that we made and he lined them up on a bench top, put them in order. The ones that were most highly crafted got A's, and the ones that got C's were those that were less well crafted. And that was the focus. Case study of the evolution of technology and engineering education is Stuyvesant High School in New York. Stuyvesant used to be an all-boys school when I went there. This is from Wikipedia, renowned for excellence in math and science. So here's a math and science school that had 25 shops, woodworking, electricity, metal shop, as well as 53 regular classrooms and an auditorium. And in those days, the focus was on tools and materials and processes, individual skill development, craftsmanship, not on teamwork, not on conceptual learning. There were no standards. Stuyvesant has been moved, rebuilt. It's actually near where the World Trade Center was. Beautiful location now, overlooking the Hudson River. Used to be, well, now it's co-ed. It used to be that a year of drafting was required. where the students did hand drawing and then CAD. Now they still take a 1-semester drawing course, but technology education has been supplanted by computer science. The major change that I've seen is the strong emphasis now on design pedagogy that corresponded to the transition from industrial arts to tech ed in the mid-'80s. Mitch Resnick did a good job in chronicling the benefits of design, including how it integrates learning, encourages pluralistic thinking, provides students a greater sense of control, inspires empathy. You can think about that as in the context of designing for people with disabilities, how that encourages students to put themselves in the minds of others and promotes reflective thinking. But too often, design as an instructional strategy is focused on the product rather than the learner, and design is not always used to maximum pedagogical advantage, as its use is characterized sometimes by trial and error problem solving and gadgeteering, where kids don't always attain the important conceptual understandings. What we've tried to do through some of our work is to improve design pedagogy by developing a model that we call informed design. Informed design looks very much like a traditional design loop, except that in that research and investigation phase, the students engage in a series of short, focused, practical tasks that we call knowledge and skill builders, which provide them the background to approach the design challenge from a more knowledgeable, more informed perspective, hence informed design. We'll talk some more a little bit later about knowledge and skill builders, and I'll give you some examples of them in one of our projects. So since the major focus of this talk is on standards, let's talk a bit about what standards mean in industry. They generally refer to some quantitative level of performance, a level of performance that's acceptable or desirable. For example, ASTM, the American Society for Testing and Materials, has developed 1,300 standards. And, you know, they quantify performance for adhesives, for cement, for paints. ISO has developed 21,000 plus standards, International Organization for Standardization, in 100 different categories, including healthcare, electronics, food technology, shipbuilding, and they've standardized, for example, let's say the good example is the international standard date notation is year, 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 month, month, day, day, and the standard for credit cards is 85.6 times 53.98 millimeters. And NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, has developed standards for services, products that rely on technology and measurement, from the smart grid, electronic health records, atomic clocks, nanomaterials, computer chips, and so on. In education, standards define what students should know and be able to do. They're not quantitative, but descriptive. The standards movement gained momentum in the 1990s. Its precursor was Bill Spady's outcome-based education movement. You know, from 1989 into the 90s, virtually all of the disciplines developed standards. The math people, NCTM, developed the Principles and Standards for School Math in '89, Art and Social Studies in '94, Standards for ELA '96, Science '96 with the National Science Education Standards, NSES, and then our Standards for Technological Literacy in 2000, and of course recently redone Standards for Technology and Engineering Literacy, STEL, in 2020. It was during the Clinton administration that serious efforts to develop state standards began. And the ESEA reauthorization included the Improving America's Schools Act to develop assessments, accountability systems based on results. In '94, George H.W. Bush implemented the Goals 2000 program, which the aspiration was that by the year 2000, the United States would be first in the world in math and science. I'll tell you a little story about that later. No Child Left Behind, sometimes referred to lovingly as No Child Left Untested, was established during George W. Bush's administration. And that NCLB required that all public schools that were receiving federal funds had to administer statewide standardized tests, and that to receive Title I funding, schools must make annual yearly progress. And the Obama administration in 2009, realizing that most of the schools would not meet the NCLB targets, initiated the Race to the Top, which provided $4.5 billion. It's amazing how funding can entice schools to try to meet those targets. However, despite the NCLB mandate that all schools had to have standards in place, there was a lot of variation in the quality of the state standards. So that's what prompted the Common Core initiative. That was released in June 2010 in ELA and Math. 46 states initially adopted the Common Core standards. Minnesota only adopted the ELA standards. As of now, many states have revised them. 12 states have introduced legislation to repeal them. 5 states have withdrawn. So the debate has been waging for some time about Common Core standards. It's sometimes a matter of political persuasion. Sometimes it's a matter of states' rights. People who are in favor say that the Common Core sets clear goals for teaching and learning, that since everybody would teach the same content, would make professional development easier, that the standards would ratchet up rigor and advance equity, get kids college ready, and improve our standing among international rankings. Those who disagree think that standardization is an industrial era model, that Common Core standards have in fact had little impact on student attainment, that many factors influence student achievement, including well-trained teachers and a social and cultural emphasis on education, that rigor is more than what standards you cover, it's how you teach. People like Glenn Beck claim that it's a backdoor means for the government to indoctrinate children. The NAEP results actually show a drop in the percentage of students prepared for college. And the latest PISA rankings show that there's a decline in the U.S. standing. The effort to develop the Common Core was launched in 2009 by the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices and the Council of Chief State School Officers. Mary Fallon, who was the governor of Oklahoma and the chair of the National Governors Association in 2013 and 14, pulled Oklahoma out of the Common Core. You can see her quote, "We are capable of developing our own Oklahoma academic standards that will be better than Common Core." An interesting note is that the person who's chiefly responsible for the Common Core standards never taught school, has no formal pedagogical training. His name is David Coleman. His company, Student Achievement Partners, played a leading role in developing the Common Core. Now he's the president of the College Board. So it really isn't a surprise, is it, that the SATs reflect these competencies. And let's take a look at what these Common Core standards are. Here are some Common Core high school standards for math. There are 162 at the high school level alone. For exponential models, express as a logarithm the solution to AB to the CT equals D, where A, C, and D are numbers, and the base B is 2, 10, or E. Prove polynomial identities and use them to describe numerical relationships. For example, the polynomial identity x squared plus y squared squared equals x squared minus y squared squared plus 2xy squared can be used to generate Pythagorean triples. Explain how the definition of the meaning of rational exponents follows from extending the properties of integer exponents to those values, allowing for a notation for radicals in terms of rational exponents. For example, we define 5 to the third to be the cube root of 5 because we want 5 to the third cubed to equal 5 to the third cubed to hold. So 5 to the third cubed must equal 5. Folks, these are for all children, all high school kids need to be held accountable for these standards. Not kidding. I don't know what we're doing to our kids. So the Common Core has created quite a national market for book publishers and test developers. Pearson paid the Council of Chief State School Officers a $100,000 grant. And in Texas alone, Pearson was paid $428 million for a 5-year assessment development contract. Essentially, test items have become proxies for standards. And this comment in a TED Talk I found was quite interesting. The only way to feed a business model in this toxic educational culture is to perpetuate a picture of failure. Private education companies are the villains. So more than half of the people who the Pew Research Center surveyed, large survey, 5,000 people, felt that STEM teachers spend too much time meeting standards and too little time on practical applications. Public school parents, 62% of them believe that problems in K-12 STEM can be attributed to too much emphasis on meeting standards. And the National Research Council has criticized standards as vague, repetitive, and poorly coordinated. They include large numbers of performance expectations and too many performance expectations lead to an overloaded curriculum. So there's also been a move toward identifying overarching thematic understandings in STEM disciplines to emphasize transferable big ideas which reoccur in different contexts. Thematic ideas provide a more holistic understanding and can encourage us to teach for transfer. So the next generation science standards considerably reduced the number of benchmarks from those listed in the National Science Education Standards and in the earlier AAAS benchmarks for science literacy. And NGSS identifies practices, for example, developing and using models, designing solutions, and cross-cutting concepts, systems, stability, structure. But there are still 191 performance expectations and 312 disciplinary core ideas for students to learn. Before and as standards were being developed, there were also studies to identify big ideas in technology and engineering education. In 1963, NSF initiated the Engineering Concepts Curriculum Project. John Truxell, a brilliant engineering educator, then the Dean of Engineering at Brooklyn Polytech, and then became Dean of Engineering at Stony Brook, he led the project. The Man-Made World was a book resulting from that project. I think today it probably would have been called The Human-Made World, but it was a seminal work that explained a set of powerful and transferable engineering concepts, primary among them modeling and systems. The story I wanted to tell you about John is about the lecture he gave to our Principles of Engineering teachers in New York State in 1995. It was during the time of Goals 2000, and he reflected on Goals 2000. He stopped during his presentation and he quipped that if we were going to be the first in the world in math and science by the year 2000, we had no time for meetings like this. In formulating a concept base for secondary level engineering, Rod Custer, Jenny Doherty, and Joe Meyer identified major engineering concepts, big ideas, among them design, systems, innovation, and modeling. The Concepts and Contexts in Engineering and Technology Education Study, CCETE, was an international research Delphi study that paneled 32 experts in the philosophy and history of technology, engineering education, and technology education. And these experts identified 5 overarching areas of understanding in technology and engineering: design, modeling, systems, resources, and human values. Mark DeVries led that study. And in a Delphi study where Moshe Barak and I furthered the work of the DeVries study, we compared perceptions of high school tech ed teachers and university engineering educators about the most important technology and engineering concepts within those 5 overarching thematic areas and added specificity to them. So our dear friend Bill Duggar led the Standards for Technological Literacy project. Bill did a great job in first obtaining funding from the NSF. Gerhard Salinger was the program officer. Gerhard, has been stalwart in support of technology education for many, many years, for decades. And Bill and his team developed the first set of standards for our field, got blessing from the National Academy of Engineering, which was no mean feat, and STL, of course, drove practice in our field considerably. There were 20 standards, 286 benchmarks, 86 benchmarks at grades at middle school, 98 benchmarks at high school level. And STL did identify some thematic ideas, among them design, systems, and resources. And the Standards for Technological and Engineering Literacy project, STEL, that was led by Tom Loveland and Marie Hopeful and Steve Barbado with NSF funding, reduced the number of standards from 20 to 8, reduced the number of benchmarks from 288 to 142, and they have identified a set of thematic ideas which they're calling practices. And you can see some of them are listed: systems thinking, ethics, communication, collaboration, so on. And of course, as this project progresses and as people begin to do some more curriculum work based upon it, it would be desirable to provide guidance as to how these practices might be revisited in a variety of contexts. So my thoughts about learning standards are truly still evolving. And my own story is a journey from being a standards evangelist. I served on the New York State, when I was at the State Ed Department in New York. I was one of the folks that led the writing effort for the state MST standards, and I served as a member of the Standards for Technological Literacy writing team. So the journey is one from being an evangelist to now being a standards skeptic. And so the reason for the skepticism is that I've been reflecting, going back to first principles. What are the overarching purposes of education? I think we'd agree that we who are educators will want to enhance civility, to help young people feel that they can make a difference in the world, to strive for social equity, of course to earn a living, to question their prejudices, and to derive optimal fulfillment from life as an educated person. And that's something we don't pay enough attention to. An educated person derives more appreciation, sees things differently. Think about a civil engineer. A civil engineer sees a bridge differently than a person who's never taken a physics or an engineering course. A person who's studied the natural sciences sees living organisms through a different prism. A musician, I'm a guitar player. Because I'm educated in that way, I watch other guitarists play, and I derive a sense of appreciation because I know something about that. I'll tell you a story. My son, when he was in high school, had just taken an art course. I think he was a junior in high school, and he and I were in Paris. We were visiting the Musée d'Orsay, which is an impressionist art museum. It used to be a railroad station, used to be the Gare d'Orsay. They turned it into this very lovely impressionist museum. And we were walking through the galleries, and my son stopped in front of a Seurat painting, and he called me over and said, "Dad, come close to this painting. What do you see?" And he pointed out that Seurat had been painting using a technique known as pointillism, sort of like halftones, but multicolored. And then he said, "Step back, take a look at the painting from a distance, and notice." So it struck me at the time what a difference his recent art education had made in terms of his ability to appreciate the artwork that we were seeing in the museum. And it made me realize that this is a mission of education. It argues for a good, solid, liberal education for all people rather than just a career focus, right? So that people are educated well enough to be able to appreciate what they take in and to derive optimal fulfillment from the life they live. And so I ask myself how technology and engineering education can best serve those purposes. In making curricular decisions, relying too much on standards and benchmarks, we can get very atomistic when we start to design curriculum and instruction. And we need to decide what really is important. Whether, for example, competencies like HSFLE A4 are needed for all students. In 1966, Michael Caine and Shelley Winters made a movie called Alfie. Alfie was a Cockney limo driver in Manhattan. He was a totally self-absorbed guy, a womanizer, thought very little about others. He came into hard times. He became reflective and started thinking about changing his ways. The title song was written by Burt Bacharach and Hal David and sung by Dionne Warwick, where the lyrics asked, "What's it all about, Alfie?"
What's it all about, Alfie? Is it just for the moment we live? What's it all about when you sort it out, Alfie?
In trying to come to grips with what it's all about, I recalled a book that I read in grad school that made a real impression. It was written by George Leonard, the editor of Look magazine. He was a Grand Master in Aikido, a founder of the Esalen Institute in California, a Renaissance man. His premise, and remember this was 1968, was that computer technology could so significantly enhance learning that children would find learning as ecstatic as a 16-year-old learning how to drive. And my takeaway was that we should try to make learning, and we could make learning ecstatic for our students. To put some of these ideas into play, we were able to obtain funding from the National Science Foundation to develop a middle school engineering program that was designed to introduce all students to engineering, not just appeal to those inclined to pursue engineering as a career path. Engineering for All developed 2 6-week curriculum units in authentic social contexts. These were contexts that were identified as some of the grand challenges for engineering by the National Academy. So the 2 units were vertical farming, fresh food for cities, and water, the world in crisis. They were areas of interest to the children because, these young people care about the world and they want to make it a better place. And through this work, they were actually able to accomplish things that made them feel very, very good about themselves and made them feel as if they were able to make a difference. The intent of the program is to truly engage our students and predispose them to want to make a difference in the world, and to instill the confidence that with continued study they can. To promote the potential of engineering as a social good, and not to say that it's always oriented to social good, as we well know from the genocidal death machines built by the Third Reich. To use authentic social contexts that resonate with the children, to revisit thematic ideas in context, ideas like design, modeling, human values, and to use informed design as pedagogy, and to open students' eyes to the role engineers play in addressing global and community-based issues and concerns. We talked about informed design pedagogy a little earlier, and we talked about the knowledge and skill builders that are preliminary to the kids engaging in the design challenges. So here are some examples. In the vertical farming unit, the kids study food deserts. They learn about hydroponic farming versus soil farming. They actually build types of hydroponic systems. They plant, they monitor, and they harvest plants, and they do CAD modeling. These are all knowledge and skill builders. And once they complete these, then they design and model a vertical farming system using hydroponics on an existing building. So that was their design challenge. In the water unit, they learn about the global water crisis, about turbidity. They actually make turbidity tubes, they design them. They learn about water contaminants, biological, physical, chemical contaminants, different filtering media, different filtering systems. And then the grand design challenge is for the kids to design and build a multi-level water filtering system that can supply safe drinking water to a family of 5. In our case, it was Bangladesh, but it can be anywhere there's an issue with water quality. During instruction, teachers revisit big ideas in different contexts. Design, systems thinking, modeling, resources needed, and addressing human values are underscored in both units. Here are some photos of the students at work designing water filtration and hydroponic systems and modeling vertical farms. Included are some teacher comments. You can see how the children benefited. My favorite is the last one, where students expressed that they wanted to go to other countries to help people address their water crises. Colleagues, when students are engaged, there's no limit to the depths of their learning. They're in a state of flow, and we'll see more about flow in just a moment. They may not learn everything in the standards documents, but they will go off on bird walks to learn what they need to know, just-in-time learning, often going far beyond what is written in the standards to solve challenging problems that have become important to them. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is a Hungarian-born psychologist who proposed the psychological concept of flow in 1975. We've all experienced flow. We feel it when we're totally engaged in something, when we do something for its own sake. We're completely focused. The ego falls away and time flies. You're intrinsically motivated. The activity becomes an end in itself. You experience a sense of ecstasy, from the Greek ekstasis, standing outside oneself, outside everyday reality. A skier is at one with the mountain. Lang Lang, totally immersed in his piano playing. Garry Kasparov in his chess. My wife in her yoga. Listen to Jamie Wyeth talk about his painting of gulls.
Sticky stuff called paint, and you apply that. And I mean, there's nobody standing over you saying paint every day. And I think in painting, much like in music or a pianist and whatnot, you have to practice. And it certainly isn't all inspired. I mean, many times working with the gulls where I just am sort of drudgery, but once in a while, things really click. And that's the opiate. When that gull all of a sudden breathes and becomes, and the fire starts building, I mean, then it's that's why you paint. That's why I paint.
The best moments in our lives are not the passive, receptive, relaxing times. The best moments usually occur if a person's body or mind is stretched to its limits in a voluntary effort to accomplish something difficult and worthwhile. Our best moments as teachers are when we enable our students to be in a state of flow. I know that arguing against beginning with standards is like smashing idols. But I have a proposal for technology and engineering curriculum design, an instructional sequence where we would plan learning experiences in the context of important societal problems that are relevant and compelling to the children, to revisit key thematic transferable ideas in contexts, and then to address a limited number of standards and benchmarks only as relevant. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I'm anxious to hear your comments and your ideas and to engage in some discussion with you.